So over the past couple of days, you've continued to do some work in your passages in your Star Prep, and many of you have begun to branch into other genres besides poetry. We tend to do very well in nonfiction, but something that I've noticed that we're struggling with as well is maybe reading our fictional passages or the literary nonfiction, which often read like fiction, in ways that we need to when we're reading them within a standardized test. A lot of times when we're reading fiction in our book of choice, we're reading for pleasure, which we should do. But when we're reading fiction or literary nonfiction, that what we know to be a story, when we're reading that in a standardized test, there are certain ways, again, that we can prepare our mind for this type of genre, just like we prepared our mind for poetry by looking at what's happening in the poem, figurative language, and then the stanzas and the way the poem is organized. There are things that we need to pay attention to in this genre as well. So today, I want to teach you that when you read a fictional text or a literary nonfiction text in which there's a narrator, that there are a few things that we need to look out for. One of those things that we need to pay special attention to is, of course, the narrator, because that is typically the main character, and especially in literary nonfiction. And when the narrator is in first person, that is a different point of view, and we're able to get a really strong glimpse into that characters. We were able to walk in their shoes, but we're also able to get a glimpse into their mind, which really makes that stand apart. And we can understand their thoughts and their internal motivations better than we can with any other point of view. Besides paying attention to the narrator, we also want to pay attention to conflict, and of course that's involving the narrator, but there are things that happen within the story that kind of make us sit up and take notice that, hey, this is the conflict. And the reason that we want to pay attention to conflict is because that is what drives the whole story forward. And around conflict is where we eventually come up with our theme, or the author reveals their main message of this piece of literature. So once again, today I want to teach you that when you read fiction or literary nonfiction, you should pay close attention to the narrator, and you should pay close attention to the things that give us clues to the conflict. So now I'm going to read a bit of more stories from Grandma's Attic, and I want you to watch and listen to me as I read and how I'm able to make notations on these different things that I should notice. Grandma called me in from the yard. Would you please go to the store for me? I'm ready to bake rolls and there isn't enough yeast. Take a quarter from my little change purse. I found Grandma's purse and put the quarter in my pocket. As I ran down the lane toward the road, it occurred to me that climbing over the fence and crossing the field would save some time, so I did just that. I was soon in the little general store that served our farming community. So something for me that I'm going to take notice of here that tells me a little bit about the narrator is that when I hear things like it occurred to me that climbing over the fence and crossing the field would save some time, that whole note of it occurred to me, that's a time where I'm getting inside the narrator's mind. So I'm able to learn right here that this person is somewhat of a planner. And this is a little different here. I was soon in the little general store. That talks more about action. Okay, so that kind of moves the story forward. Mr. Jenkins, I said, Grandma needs some yeast. Mr. Jenkins set 3 cakes of yeast on the counter. His eyes twinkled and he smiled at me. And what do you need? I knew what he meant. I was always allowed to pick a penny candy when I came to the store with Grandma, but Grandma wasn't here, and she hadn't said anything about spending a penny. So once again, here's that internal thought, and right here, we see that there's some kind of beginning of a conflict going on because it started the sentence with but Grandma wasn't here and she hadn't said anything about spending a penny. So I'm going to make just a note here that this might be the beginning of a conflict. I'm not for sure though. How much change do I have from a quarter? I asked. 7 cents, Mr. Jenkins replied. The yeast is 6 cents a cake. I thought that over quickly. I would have a nickel and 2 pennies back. I was sure Grandma wouldn't care if I spent 1 penny, and if she were here, she might even say I could have them both. The longer I gazed at the candy display, the more certain I became that I needed 2 pennies worth as a reward for coming to the store alone. So this is interesting here. We're getting a little more of a glimpse into the narrator's mind. As Mr. Jenkins handed me the candy and the nickel, a twinge inside me said this was not really an honest thing to do. So we know that when the main character starts having like heavy internal like dialogue, or something happens inside of them that's kind of out of the ordinary. So right here, a twinge, and the language here says not really an honest thing to do. Here is where the conflict really lies, right? This is the conflict. They're about to do something that's honest or not honest, right? That's the choice they're going to have to make. That wasn't my money, and I hadn't asked if I might spend it. Nevertheless, I put the nickel in my pocket and started home. This time, I took the long way around by the road. Thank you, Grandma said when I laid the yeast on the table. Did you put the change back in my purse? Yes, Grandma, I replied, hurrying out to the porch. I hadn't really lied to Grandma, I argued with myself. Okay, so here we go. Right here, the main character, the narrator, is arguing with self, right? Again, that's that internal dialogue, and they're talking to themselves, convincing themselves that I hadn't really lied to Grandma. I did put back all the change I had. So again, there's more of that internal dialogue. Up here, we saw thoughts, right? And here we talked about like the twinge that was happening. So this is out of the ordinary. And then here, she's actually like, we see the words that she's telling to herself. But I had spent 2 pennies without permission. The second piece of candy in my pocket, didn't sound like a good idea anymore. I knew I had deceived Grandma, and I was miserable about it. So we were right. There was some deceit there. Later that morning, Uncle Roy came to the house for a glass of cold tea. He sat down beside me on the steps. Well, what have you been doing with yourself this morning? I went to the store for Grandma, and since then I've just been sitting here. Uncle Roy looked down at me shrewdly. Something on your mind, is there? I guess so. I'm thinking it over, I replied slowly. So we know from reading fiction as well, when some character comes in with the main character or the narrator who's a little bit older than them, we know that that advice from the older character often signals that we're about to learn something about theme or conflict as well. So here we have Uncle Roy, and we're just going to call him the wiser, like word from the wiser. If there's something you should tell your grandma, I'd advise you to get busy and do it. He chuckled as he got up to leave. Chances are she knows about it anyway, and the kinder she is to you, the more miserable you'll be. So as you can see here, and I'm going to stop here, as you can see, we had quite a few clues about the narrator. If I go back and re-examine what I did, I noticed at the beginning, and I paid attention to some thoughts that were going on in the narrator's mind here. So I was able to make an inference here, right? She was kind of a planner. Here again, we went to thoughts. But Grandma wasn't here, and she hadn't said anything about spending a penny because the language kind of shifted. I'm noticing here that's beginning of a conflict. So conflict. Mr. Jenkins handed me the candle and a twinge inside of me. So this was something that's out of the ordinary. And we know that when things are out of the ordinary, that signals conflict as well. And then finally, we go back down here to arguing with your self, which is an internal dialogue. That also is kind of a significant thing that happens because that gives us a signal that, oh, here again, there's conflict and that main character is changing. So today, as you read possibly in a fictional passage or a literary nonfiction that reads like a story, you also will notice these kind of things and pay attention to the narrator, and look for signposts in the literature, things such as internal dialogue like we saw, or their thoughts, or even when another character comes in and offers advice. These are all things that can signal us about the conflict, and we know from taking standardized tests that they most likely will ask us questions about character actions and conflict. Good luck.